I left my lake house for a month, and my security logs started acting like someone else lived there. I came home early from a month overseas to find police lights flashing across my porch and the HOA president wearing my late wife's robe. She told them I was a trespasser. What she didn't know was that my house had been watching her the whole time, and it had recorded every lie she lived inside my walls. The lake held the last light like a coin. Ripples carried a strip of gold toward the black timber of the lodge, while my old pickup rattled up the ranch road, gravel ticking like rain on a tin pan. When I swung the gate, the hinge sang a dry note I didn't recognize. I'd been gone too long. I eased to a stop beneath the cottonwoods where the ground turns from dust to crushed granite. Crickets worked at the edges. The dock tapped softly against its cleats. Then the night split. Red and blue light clawed through the trees and smeared across my hood. Sirens wound down with 2 short coughs and died. For a second I thought I'd taken the wrong turn. Then I saw my porch and the figure moving on it, backlit by the foyer lamps. The figure lifted a hand. My late wife's silk robe poured from its wrist like a slow wave and pointed at me. "There he is, officer. That's the man trying to break in." I shut off the engine. Dust came chasing, then slowed where the lake pulled cool across the yard. I took my suitcase from the bench seat and closed the door with my elbow, polite, like taking off a hat. 2 cruisers sat askew in the gravel circle, light bars pawing the dark. A third vehicle, a silver SUV I'd already learned to dislike, was parked crooked, as if entitlement could bend geometry. "Hands where we can see them," a young voice called. "Sir, stay right there." I lifted my free hand and kept the suitcase low. Behind the kid came Sheriff McKay, broad in the shoulders, steady in the eyes, a man who listened for the truth underneath the words. We'd talked before over loose cattle and spring water on county roads. "You Jake Remy?" he asked. "I am." On the porch, Bethany Whitfield, president of the Redwater Estates HOA, tightened the robe's belt like it was a medal. In that light I could see the print. Blue cranes on cream silk, a gift from a different life. She looked smaller in it, and somehow louder. "He's lying," she said, breath quick with confidence. "The owner's overseas. I'm responsible for this property tonight." I looked past her into the hall. The Navajo runner lay rucked against the baseboard, a heel that didn't know the house snagging the corner. A wineglass stood on the entry table without a coaster, a wet ring shining like a mean little moon. "Sir," the young officer said, hands hovering near his belt, "we got a report of an attempted break-in. We need to establish a way," I said. "I'll stand right here." Wind moved through the cottonwoods like pages turning. The lake laid a cool hand across my neck. I set my suitcase down, palm flat on the lid to steady it. Steady me. Bethany came down 2 steps, careful, silk whispering. Up close, the fabric showed a clean crease from years folded in a cedar drawer. She smiled at the officers the way you smile at a waiter who knows your usual. Then she pitched her voice for the neighbors. "Thank God you came." He followed, me from the gate, circling, peeking through windows. I had come straight down the drive. The only circles belonged to swallows, but her lie was practiced, its corners rounded from use. "Ms. Whitfield," McKay said, just enough gravel to count. "Dispatch says you're here with owner authorization." "It's in our bylaws," she said. "Emergency access, community safety. There's been a leak. We're caretaking, doing our duty." "Caretaking wears his wife's robe?" I asked, and kept the heat out of it. Her eyes flicked down at the cranes, surprise then paint over. "We need ID," the kid said to me, firmer now. "If you have it." "In my inside pocket," I said. "May I?" "Slowly," McKay answered. I moved slow. He read my license, eyes sliding to the door and back. When he reached the address line, a decision settled on him like a saddle. "Address matches," he told the kid. The light bars kept washing the cedar, red, then blue, then red again. Bethany laughed, brittle as a jar lid. "A forgery," she said. "These men have tricks. I'm the president here. My word carries the community." McKay looked at the lock, a small pane of glass pulsing a patient green. The lodge felt like a dog that had heard my boots on the road and was already at the door. "Mr. Remy," he said, "what can you show us without stepping inside?" "The house will talk," I said. I climbed one step and set my thumb on the reader. The bolt pulled back with a sound like a carpenter swallowing. The door pushed an inch and stopped, polite as a man clearing his throat. Silence settled. A moth shouldered the foyer lamp and decided to stay. In that hush, the explanation Bethany was building wouldn't stand upright. I raised my phone, screen bright. I didn't wave it. I let it witness. The porch, the open seam of my door, the officers steady as fence posts, the robe that wasn't hers. "Ma'am," McKay said, careful as a bell in fog, "step back on the porch and keep your hands to yourself while we sort this." "It's all mine tonight," she said, but the words sagged before they landed. Beyond her shoulder, I could see the framed copy of my deed, the real one sleeping in the safe. Paper older than any HOA rule, older than half the cottonwoods on this shore. The county seal caught a bar of blue light and sent it back in a small, defiant wink. The young officer shifted. "Sir," he said, softer, "if this is your residence, do you consent to us confirming your authorization to be here?" "I do," I said, and it felt like saying vows into the grain of my own floor. Crickets started again. The lights painted the log columns until the red looked like spilled paint and the blue like puddles after rain. I rolled my suitcase onto the slate and let the handle fall. I had questions stacked like split cedar. Who gave her the key? How long she'd nested here? What footprints I'd find in rooms I kept closed? But questions could wait. The land was already speaking. Gates learn walks, floors know knees. Water remembers the hand that set its banks. Bethany studied me, sharp and calculating, like a person eyeing a river and deciding which bend to lie about. She squared herself inside silk she didn't own and pulled air like a speech. "Officer," she said brightly, "I'd like him removed. Now. He's a danger." The sheriff didn't blink. "What I'd like," he said, "is the truth to sit a spell." The lake breathed. The door waited, 1 inch open, as if it knew there were worse things than night air to let inside. I stood on my own step, suitcase by my boot, and let the house make the first statement. The next morning, the world looked washed clean, though nothing truly was. The sheriff's cruisers had long gone, leaving only tire marks pressed into the dew, a kind of punctuation the land made when it witnessed foolishness. I brewed coffee, the first pot in a month, and stood by the window, watching fog drag its sleeves over the water. The lodge was mine again, quiet, patient, but it felt like a stranger returning to his own skin after surgery. While I waited for the lake to turn silver with the sun, I flipped through the HOA notices piled on the sideboard. Their tone never changed, polished threats written in corporate italics. "Violation of Community Standard 4B," one began. "Unauthorized mailbox modification." Another warned about a non-conforming landscape feature. The old cottonwood tree that shaded the dock, older than every board in this house. The signatures at the bottom were always the same. Bethany Whitfield, President, Redwater Estates Association. She'd been in power 6 years when I bought the property. I'd met her that first summer at the community gate. A smile too bright, eyes too narrow, perfume sharp as lemon cleaner. "We like order around here," she'd said. handing me a welcome packet thicker than a Bible. Keeps values high. I'd nodded, too polite, already thinking of the dam job in Helena and the promise of peace after years of hydro reports and city clamor. I should have read the fine print. The bylaws were her scripture. She'd turned the HOA into a court of petty grievances. Fines for grass too tall, flags too faded, fences too rustic. One neighbor got a letter because his dog barked during a thunderstorm. Another because her wind chimes were audibly intrusive. Nobody fought back. It was easier to pay than to endure the barrage of certified envelopes. She'd learned that fear could be mailed. When my turn came, I tried diplomacy. The mailbox was my first offense. Brushed steel, minimalist, in keeping with the lodge's modern angles. Bethany arrived at dawn, clipboard tucked under her arm, judgment already loaded. Non-compliant, she declared, tapping the box with her pen. We require colonial green with brass trim. This matches the architecture, I'd said. She smiled like I'd confessed a sin. Architecture is subjective. Rules are not. That was the moment I understood she didn't protect the neighborhood. She possessed it. Every signature on a violation, every forced compliance, tightened the crown on her paper throne. She wasn't a villain in the cartoon sense. She was something smaller and more corrosive, a person who believed order was love and control was virtue. I replaced the mailbox, green and ugly, and thought the storm would pass. Instead, it fed her. Within a month, I'd been cited for unauthorized modifications to lighting, improperly stored refuse, and unapproved flora. I remember staring at the letter about the Japanese maple I'd planted for my late wife, wondering if grief required a permit. My neighbor, Ernest Walker, leaned on the fence one evening, laughing softly. "Don't take it personal," he said. "She fined me last winter because my holiday wreath was hung off-center. Woman's been queen of this cul-de-sac since the first foundation was poured." "Doesn't anyone vote her out?" I'd asked. He grinned, showing teeth like old ivory. "She runs unopposed, nobody wants the job, and everyone's afraid she'll raise dues if they try." I thought then that I could live around her, keep my head down, pay my dues, let her rule her paper kingdom while I ruled the quiet in my own yard. But power doesn't stay contained when it smells new land. She'd begun to fixate on my property. The lake frontage, the lodge, the newness that offended her sense of inheritance. It started with casual intrusions. A routine inspection announced by email, a walk down my dock without asking, her hand grazing the railing as if testing ownership. Once she even brought Gary, her husband, to measure setbacks. He'd mumbled apologies while she scribbled imaginary violations. I saw envy in her eyes every time she glanced at the lake, the way the sunlight lit its curve, untamed and outside her bylaws. That winter, at the HOA meeting held in the community hall, she proposed an amendment, emergency access for property protection. She framed it as safety, a way to enter homes if alarms triggered or pipes burst. It passed by a timid majority, sold on fear. I voted no. Afterward, she stopped me by the coffee urn. "Nothing to worry about, Mr. Remy," she'd said sweetly. "We're all neighbors here. We look out for one another." I remember answering, "Some gates are built to keep danger out, some to keep peace in." Her smile never cracked. "We'll see which kind yours is." When I left for the inspection contract months later, I thought of that line more than I should have. I'd emailed the board my travel dates, as required. I'd even double-checked the locks, the security cameras, the water sensors in the basement. I believed logic and preparation could fence in madness. Standing now in the same hall, reading her notices, I saw what the lake already knew. Rules were her camouflage, paperwork her weapon. She'd wrapped herself in bureaucracy like armor, convinced it made her untouchable. The robe the night before had just been another costume. I sipped the last of the coffee, Outside, the fog had burned away, revealing the reflection of my house, still standing, still mine. But the reflection looked different, like it was studying me back. The paper queen had overplayed her hand. She'd forgotten that land keeps receipts and water keeps secrets. When I left Redwater, the lake was still frozen along its shaded edge. The early spring wind came down off the peaks like a saw blade, carving the surface into a shifting mirror. I remember looking back from the ridge road, watching the lodge shrink into a patch of gray timber and glass against the white. It had taken years of overtime contracts and half a lifetime of patience to own something that stillness could call home. The job in Colorado wasn't optional. A small private dam near Elk Creek was showing stress fractures, and the board wanted my signature on the inspection before the thaw. It was a month's work, good pay, good solitude. I told myself that time away would cool the quiet feuds that had flared with Bethany's HOA. Before leaving, I did what law and sense required. I sent an email to the board with my travel dates, May 1st through June 1st, and attached the notice form their bylaws demanded. I printed 2 copies for my files and set one beside the safe, under the framed deed. That paper, older than Bethany's entire organization, was my firewall against nonsense. The lodge had its own sentry system, a patchwork of sensors I'd designed years ago for a water control project. Pressure mats at the doors, cameras in the eaves, smart thermostats that logged every change. Some folks hang horseshoes for luck. Engineers hang redundancies. When I locked the door, the bolt hummed once and the system woke, ready to report every breath that moved inside. The road out of the valley wound through cottonwoods just starting to green. At the last turn, I passed Ernest Walker mending his fence. He raised a hand without stopping the rhythm of his hammer. "Keep your receipts," he called. "She counts every nail." I laughed then. A month away felt like a reprieve. The work in Elk Creek filled the days. Dawn to dusk, I walked concrete catwalks, listening for the groan that means pressure has found a weakness. Nights were motel quiet. Thin coffee, thick reports. The world narrowed to numbers, flow rates, stress graphs, safety codes. Still, every evening before bed, I opened the lodge's security app and checked the logs. It was a habit as steady as breathing. For the first week, everything read perfect. Energy use flatlined, cameras dark, thermostats idle. Then the second week, a small ripple, an adjustment to the heating schedule. A blip, 72 degrees in the master suite, just after midnight. I chalked it up to a glitch. Algorithms hiccup. 2 days later, another entry. Refrigerator door opened, weight sensors adjusting. A gallon of milk added, a bottle of wine removed. I don't drink milk, and the only wine in my cellar is single vineyard Cabernet, not grocery store Chardonnay. I stared at the numbers until they blurred. Sensors don't lie. They measure. Someone was in the house. That night, I watched the live feed from the lakeside camera. The reflection of porch lights glowed in the water, steady, calm. Then movement. Figure crossing the dock, robe flaring pale in the dark. She held a wine glass that caught the moon. Bethany. I muted the video before I woke the whole motel. My pulse drummed like the spillway turbines. She wasn't breaking in. She was settled. I switched through angles. The kitchen, the living room, the hallway. The camera over the fireplace showed her husband Gary, half asleep in my chair, flipping channels on my remote. Their shoes sat neatly by the hearth. It was almost elegant, how they'd invaded without force. A bureaucratic burglary. The same clause she'd written for emergency access had opened my door. I closed the laptop and sat on the edge of the bed. The heater rattled, smelling faintly of dust. A part of me wanted to call McKay right then, but I could already hear Bethany's voice, smooth and civic. "Inspection officer, we thought there was a leak." We're ensuring community safety. She'd practiced those lines for years. I took a breath and let the anger run its circuit. The engineer in me began sorting the facts. What I had was evidence of presence, not intent. What I needed was proof she knew she was trespassing. The kind of proof that makes lawyers smile. So I set traps, not physical, but digital. I expanded the motion grid to include audio. I cross-linked energy consumption with door sensors. I told the smart system to log every pattern it didn't recognize. The house became a quiet witness, one that never forgot. Each morning before heading to the dam, I checked the feeds. The data grew like ivy, hourly entries, heat maps, timestamps. Bethany's routine unfolded with the precision of arrogance. Breakfast at 8, midday wine at noon, television from 9 to midnight. By the end of the third week, she'd even hosted guests. The cameras caught 2 cars at the dock, 4 people laughing under the porch lanterns. My lanterns. I stored everything, video, audio, logs, on a secure drive labeled Redwater Evidence. I encrypted it twice. The password was simple. Eleanor. My late wife had always believed that patience was a form of strength. In the last days of May, the Elk Creek job wrapped. The dam passed inspection. My report went off to the state office. I could have stayed the extra week, flown home on schedule, pretended ignorance. But ignorance had already cost me enough peace. The lake in Redwater waited, and its memory was long. I booked an earlier flight and sent one final message to the house. Record continuously until my return. Some truths like rivers only settle when the pressure's released. The flight home felt shorter than I remembered. Clouds rolled below like fields of snow, silent and indifferent. I spent the hours reading data reports, each column of numbers another heartbeat from my home. The smart system kept feeding me its testimony. Temperature spikes, door openings, water usage. Every entry painted the same story. 2 people living a borrowed life in my house. I landed in Bozeman to a sharp wind that smelled of pine resin and faraway rain. The rental car felt strange after the old pickup. Too quiet. Too new. I drove the 3 hours back to Redwater with the radio off, the road unspooling through valleys the color of rusted copper. Every mile was a drumbeat, every curve an unanswered question. By the time I reached the turnoff for the lake, the sun had slipped behind the ridge, leaving that blue-gray hour when shadows forget their edges. My gate stood closed, chain latched, lock untouched. From the road, the lodge glowed soft and golden, windows open, smoke trailing from the chimney like a signature. I pulled over before the drive, shut off the engine, and let the night speak. From somewhere across the water came faint laughter, the light, careless kind that doesn't belong to people with guilt. She'd turned my home into a weekend retreat. I gripped the wheel and forced the anger down. Emotion wouldn't hold up in court. Evidence would. Inside the car, I opened my laptop. The live feed loaded slow on the weak signal, but the image was clear enough. Bethany, in one of my plaid shirts, was pouring wine for 2 guests, a man and woman from the HOA board. They toasted something and laughed, her voice carrying through the microphone. "Can you believe he hasn't changed a thing since his wife died?" she said. "All this space wasted on sentiment." The man answered, "Well, he's rich enough to rebuild if it ever burned down." She laughed again, sharp and mean. "Don't tempt me." The words hung in the air like a stain. I watched them move from room to room, taking small liberties, fingers trailing across furniture, opening drawers, pulling bottles from the cabinet. When they finally left, the clock in the frame read past midnight. Bethany lingered at the window, looking out over the lake, unaware of the eye watching her from inside her own reflection. I captured the footage, labeled it Exhibit C, and started the slow upload to my encrypted drive. Over the next 3 days, I worked quietly, staying in a motel on the edge of town. I needed more than voyeurism. I needed proof of intent. She'd claim she was there for maintenance, supervision, anything but theft. What would undo her wasn't the act. It would be her words. So I adjusted the system. Microphones in the living room, hallway, office, rooms she favored. The program would trigger only when her voice matched prior recordings. It didn't take long. On the third night, at 8:17 p.m., the system caught gold. Her voice, close to the office mic, drawled with whine. "He's off in Asia until June," she said. "Gary, relax, he won't know. He never checks the logs. By the time he comes back, we'll have the place spotless." Gary's voice, low, uneasy. "Barb, what if he changes plans?" "He won't," she said. "He's a creature of habit. That's why he's so predictable, and why we can enjoy a little upgrade." Upgrade. The word hit like a door slamming. I leaned back in the motel chair, the screen's glow washing the room in cold light. There it was. The intent, the arrogance, the confession without prompting. The law didn't need drama. It needed precision. I trimmed the file, isolated her voice, and saved it as Exhibit A, mens rea. That night, I didn't sleep. I made a list of every law she'd broken: criminal trespass, unlawful occupancy, misuse of association authority. But the greater crime, the one no court would name, was the theft of peace. In the early hours, I called David Chen, a lawyer I'd worked with years back when a contractor tried to shortchange the county dam budget. He picked up after 2 rings. "Remy," he said, voice thick with sleep. "You sound like someone just cut your power." "Worse, Paul," I said. "Someone moved into it." By morning, David was on his way. I emailed him the logs, the footage, the audio. His reply came 1 line long. "This isn't just a case, it's a lesson." We decided on patience. Bethany thought she had time. I'd let her keep thinking that. The evidence would cook itself. Every hour she stayed was another tick on the clock of her own undoing. I spent the day at a diner off Route 12, nursing coffee and rewriting my report for Elk Creek. Outside, rain came and went, stitching the valley in silver threads. Somewhere behind that weather, my house was living a double life. One version in my memories, another in her control. The rain eased near dusk. I drove to the overlook above the lake, parked behind the stand of junipers, and watched the lodge lights flicker on. The water caught each glow and spread it, so it looked like the house was floating. Through binoculars, I saw her silhouette cross the window, slow and deliberate. She raised a curtain, peered out, then disappeared into the kitchen. Steam curled from a pot on the stove. The domesticity of it all was obscene. That night, I recorded everything again: audio, video, data logs, even the thermostat changes. By midnight, I had a full ledger of their occupancy. I closed the laptop and stared at my reflection in the glass. For a long time, I didn't see anger or triumph, only exhaustion. Then, somewhere in that mirrored darkness, a plan began to take shape. If she wanted a stage, I'd give her one. But this time, the audience would be the law. Morning came gray and windless. The motel walls seemed thinner than ever, the kind that remember every footstep in the hall. I sat on the edge of the bed, poured motel coffee into a paper cup, and opened the files again. What stared back at me wasn't trespass. It was routine. Bethany Whitfield had built herself a second life in my house, one that ran like clockwork. If she'd had the arrogance to live there, she'd have the arrogance to talk about it. All I had to do was listen long enough. I called David Chen just after dawn. He answered like a man who hadn't gone to bed. "You've got enough to hang her," he said, "but not to make it stick. We'll need intent and a witness. The sheriff's seen HOA power plays before. He'll believe data, not drama." "Then data's what he'll get," I said. I spent the next 2 days turning my evidence into an engineering report. Every anomaly was time-stamped, logged, and cross-referenced. Thermostat spikes, door entries, appliance weights, water use. A spreadsheet of trespass, built line by line. The more I documented, the clearer her pattern became. Her confidence growing each day, her sense of ownership hardening like wet concrete. At night, I replayed the audio from her office phone call. Her voice, soaked in wine and vanity, filled the room again. He's off in Asia till June. He's predictable. That single word, predictable, was the cornerstone of my plan. The engineer in me understood pressure. You don't destroy a dam by force. You open the floodgates at the right moment. On the third evening, a cold rain swept in from the ridges. I drove to the overlook again, watching the lodge lights flicker through the mist. The sound of distant thunder rolled across the lake, low and deliberate. I thought of the dam reports stacked in my bag, of how every fracture begins as a hairline no one sees. Bethany's fracture was already spreading. I called David again. "I'm coming home early," I told him. "May 15th. He didn't ask why. He just said, "Then make sure she's there when you arrive. Let her set the scene herself." The next morning, I sent a short email to my airline. Ticket changed, seat confirmed. Then I scheduled the smart system to send me hourly updates until my plane touched down. If she wanted to play house, she could do it under surveillance. That night, unable to sleep, I scrolled through the camera feeds one last time. There she was, curled on my couch, wearing one of Eleanor's sweaters. My wife had folded that sweater herself before the hospital took her. Seeing it draped across Bethany's shoulders hit deeper than any insult. My hands curled into fists, then unclenched again. Proof, not fury. I opened the fridge log. Weight reduction of 6 pounds, corresponding to 2 steaks and a bottle of scotch. The water meter showed showers at regular intervals, 2 per day. The thermostat noted late-night adjustments, 72 degrees, 74, 76. Luxury, warmth. The woman was comfortable in my grief. I turned to the column labeled Guest Entries. On May 12th, a new entry appeared. 2 additional cell phones detected by the Wi-Fi hub. I switched the feed to the kitchen camera. Bethany and Gary sat with 2 neighbors laughing over dinner, toasting to something unseen. The microphones caught her voice again. "You know, I should have been the one to design this place. He wasted half the lot on trees." Gary said nothing. His silence was a familiar shape, the silence of someone who's learned not to interrupt a queen. I logged the footage, backed it up to the encrypted drive, and labeled the folder for the sheriff. Before dawn, I packed my things. The rain had stopped, leaving the world rinsed and sharp. The highway glittered under the first light like a blade waiting for its purpose. At the airport, I checked my phone one last time. A fresh log entry blinked on the screen. Front door opened, user access, HOA key. The timestamp read 7:43 a.m. She was still inside. Perfect. The flight felt longer going back. I tried to sleep, but the hum of the engines sounded too much like rushing water. Somewhere over the Rockies, I dreamed of the lodge half submerged, my furniture floating like ghosts of things once owned. When I landed, David's text was waiting. Sheriff briefed. "Keep calm. Let her act first." Outside the terminal, the wind carried the scent of wet sage. I hired a simple cab instead of my usual driver, asking him to drop me at the start of Redwater Road. The driver glanced at the address and whistled. "Fancy place up there," he said. "Belongs to some HOA lady, right?" "Not for long," I said quietly. The cab rolled to a stop beside the split-rail fence. I stepped out into the twilight, suitcase in one hand, phone in the other. Down the hill, the lodge glowed again, smoke rising from the chimney, lights warm and unashamed. I took a long breath of the cold air. The wind off the lake smelled of wet wood and endings. The stage was set. The cab rolled to a stop beside the split-rail fence. I stepped out into the twilight, suitcase in one hand, phone in the other. Down the hill, the lodge glowed again, smoke rising from the chimney, lights warm and unashamed. I took a long breath of the cold air. The wind off the lake smelled of wet wood and endings. The stage was set. I watched the cab's taillights fade down the county road until darkness took them. The valley went still except for frogs and the faint metallic tick of the cooling engine behind me. The gravel crunched softly under my boots as I started the slow walk toward the house. Every few steps, I lifted the phone just enough to catch a frame of video. The gate, the dock, the porch light burning like a lantern for the wrong kind of traveler. I'd walked that path 1,000 times before, usually with a fishing rod or a stack of mail. That night, it felt like moving through someone else's dream. The closer I came, the clearer the sounds grew. Music, laughter, the clink of glass. They were inside, alive with comfort. My home had a pulse again, only it didn't beat for me. At the curve of the drive, I stopped behind the cottonwoods. Through the branches, I could see her. Bethany reclined on the porch sofa, a throw blanket wrapped around her legs, one of Eleanor's books open on her lap. Gary sat at her feet, silent, eyes fixed on the television visible through the window. The scene looked rehearsed, domestic, safe, false. I steadied my breathing and pressed record. The phone camera caught the reflection of the lake and, beyond it, her face when she finally noticed me. First confusion, then disbelief, then the familiar tightening around her mouth, the look of someone cornered who refuses to admit it. She stood, wineglass in hand. "Gary," she hissed. "There's someone," then louder, sharper, for the night to hear. "Who are you? What do you think you're doing on this property?" I stepped out from behind the trees, suitcase dragging a soft line through the gravel. "Evening, Bethany." Her eyes widened as the pieces rearranged in her mind. Recognition arrived, followed closely by panic, then anger, the 3 stages of guilt. "That's impossible," she said. "You're supposed to be overseas. The owner isn't due back until June 1st. "That's an interesting thing to know," I said. She hesitated only a heartbeat before snapping the mask back on. "You're trespassing. This property's under HOA supervision. I'm calling the police." Her phone was already in her hand. I didn't stop her. I just raised mine, the camera still running. "Please do," I said. She turned away, speaking too fast, words tumbling into the night. "Yes, this is an emergency. There's a man here. He's threatening me. He claims he owns the house. Please, hurry." While she performed, I walked to the porch steps and set my suitcase down. The air was thick with the scent of pine smoke and Chardonnay. Inside, the fire popped, scattering embers like punctuation. 10 minutes later, sirens rose in the distance, echoing through the hills. Gary came to the doorway, pale and sweating. "Beth," he whispered, "maybe we should—" "Quiet," she snapped. "He's not winning this." The cruisers rolled in, gravel spraying under their tires. Blue light swept across the porch, catching every guilty surface. The open wine bottle, the folded blanket, my initials embroidered on the edge. 2 officers stepped out. One was young, nerves still new. The other, broader, slower, was Sheriff McKay. He looked from her to me and back again. "Evening, folks," he said. "Let's all take a breath." Bethany pointed at me, trembling with righteous fury. "That man broke in. I'm the HOA president. I'm protecting this property." McKay's gaze settled on me. "Mr. Remy?" "Evening, Sheriff," I said calmly. "Back a little early." Her face drained. "That's not possible," she stammered. McKay didn't answer. He just extended his hand. "Sir, do you have identification?" I handed him my license. He studied it, then the door behind me. The lock's glass panel still pulsed with its steady green light. "Bethany," he said, his tone changing. "Did you use an HOA key to enter this residence?" "It's within our rights," she said quickly. "Emergency clause. There was a concern about the water system. The system's remote monitored," I interrupted. "No alerts for months. I can show you the logs." McKay nodded once. "Let's keep this simple. Mr. Remy, can you confirm ownership without stepping past the threshold?" "Of course." I reached forward and pressed my thumb to the reader. The soft click echoed louder than the sirens. The bolt slid back. The young officer's eyebrows lifted. McKay exhaled through his nose, something between relief and weariness. "That'll do," he said. Bethany's voice cracked. "It could be faked. He hacked it. He's dangerous. You have to arrest him." I said nothing. The house was already testifying. The sheriff stepped aside and spoke quietly into his radio. The younger cop holstered his weapon, shifting awkwardly. The wind stirred again, scattering ash across the porch. "Ma'am," McKay said finally, "I think we're done pretending tonight. You're going to stand right here until we sort this out." Bethany tried one last move. "You can't talk to me like that," she snapped. "I represent the association." "Then you'll want to represent yourself carefully," he said. Behind her, the door swung open another inch. Light spilled onto the porch like a confession. Inside, the hearth crackled, and somewhere deeper in the lodge, the security chime beeped softly. Recording. Always recording. I stood still, hands loose at my sides, while the sound of her voice unraveled into the night. The sheriff didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Ma'am," he said, steady as bedrock, "step back onto the porch. You'll stay there until we're done." Bethany hesitated, caught between defiance and the kind of fear that arrives too late to be useful. Gary hovered in the doorway, his face drained of color. I could see the shape of his regret as clearly as the lines of his silhouette against the firelight. McKay turned to me. "Mr. Remy, I'm going to need to confirm the ownership records. You mind stepping inside to get your documents?" I shook my head. "They're in the safe, but the lock will tell you more than any paper." I stepped forward and laid my thumb against the panel again. The scanner blinked green, and the heavy latch clicked open fully this time. The sound rolled across the porch like a gavel striking wood. The younger officer whistled under his breath. McKay nodded once. "That's definitive enough." Bethany tried to laugh, but the sound wavered. "Technology can be fooled," she said. "You can fake that." "Then let's test another kind of lock," I said quietly. I pulled my wallet from my jacket and handed McKay my driver's license, the address clear under my name. The sheriff held it beneath the porch light. The green reflection from the biometric panel glinted across the lamination. "Address matches," he said simply. Bethany opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. The robe she'd stolen, the one that had belonged to Eleanor, shifted off her shoulder, exposing the edge of a monogrammed collar. The sight of it made my stomach twist, not with anger this time, but something colder. McKay straightened. "Ma'am," he said, "you need to explain how you came to be inside this home tonight." She lifted her chin. "I was performing an inspection. We had reports of a water issue." "From who?" "The HOA board," she said, voice rising. "I am the board." Her argument collapsed under its own weight. I stayed silent. The law didn't need my help. It needed her noise. McKay glanced at his deputy. "Reed, call in dispatch. Have them check for any recorded reports from this address in the last 30 days. The deputy moved to the side, radio crackling. I could hear the faint exchange of static and protocol. Then, "Negative, Sheriff. No reports filed. No work orders either." The quiet that followed was heavy enough to feel. Bethany's hand trembled. The phone she'd used to summon the police now hung useless. Mrs. Whitfield, McKay said, tone final, you might want to stop talking. Just then, headlights swept across the yard. A black sedan rolled to a halt by the mailbox. David Chen stepped out, immaculate in a dark suit that looked foreign against the dust. He walked up the drive like a man late to a meeting he'd already prepared for. Evening, Sheriff, he said, offering his hand. David Chen, legal counsel for Mr. Remy. Bethany blinked at him, confusion replacing arrogance. You brought a lawyer? David smiled politely. No, ma'am. He brought evidence. I'm just here to translate it. He opened his briefcase and drew out a tablet, slick with fingerprints from too many hours of work. Sheriff, this device contains direct footage from Mr. Remy's property surveillance system. Dated, time-stamped, and chain of custody verified. Would you like to see something specific? McKay gestured for him to proceed. David tapped the screen. The audio clip played, Bethany's voice sharp and unmistakable. He's not due back until June 1st. We'll be gone by the 31st. Clean everything up, and he'll never even know we were here. The words rang clear over the sound of the lake wind. Bethany's face froze mid-expression, like wet plaster cooling into permanence. The deputy stopped writing. McKay rubbed the bridge of his nose. That's enough, counselor. I'm not done, David said mildly, but that'll do for tonight. Gary finally spoke, his voice breaking apart. She made me do it. I told her it was wrong. Bethany turned on him. Gary, don't. But he already had. McKay stepped forward, his shadow cutting across the porch. Mrs. Whitfield, you have the right to remain silent, he said, his voice now the sound of closing doors. The metallic click of the cuffs came next, 2 quick notes that ended the performance. She didn't resist. She just stared past me, eyes unfocused, as if trying to locate the power that had carried her this far and vanished the moment truth touched it. Gary sat down on the step, head in his hands. I just wanted it quiet, he muttered. The sheriff's radio squawked again. He acknowledged the call, nodded to me, then turned back to his prisoner. We'll finish this at the station. When the cruisers pulled away, the night felt enormous. The red and blue lights faded up the road, swallowed by pines. I stood in the same spot she'd occupied hours earlier, breathing the air she'd stolen. The robe she'd worn still hung over the porch rail, abandoned. I folded it carefully, holding it by the sleeves, and carried it inside. The house exhaled as the door closed. I sat by the fire until the coals turned gray. The silence wasn't empty. It was full of things finally put back where they belonged. Outside, the cruisers were long gone, their tire tracks fading under a thin dust of lake wind. I could still see the ghost of blue light on the window pane, the echo of handcuffs catching it. I hadn't realized how deep I'd been breathing until the room fell still. Every sound that came after, wood creaking, water licking the dock, felt like the house was testing its own heartbeat. David had stayed behind long enough to help me secure the evidence in one clean chain of custody. We sealed the drives in plastic, labeled, signed, time-stamped. You won't need to testify for months, he'd said, gathering his coat. The digital trail's airtight. What she did wasn't a misunderstanding. It was fraud with a porch view. I'd nodded, too tired to feel satisfaction. Will the board survive her arrest? Not in its current shape. They'll scatter. Every petty tyrant needs followers, and she just lost hers. When the door closed behind him, I realized the lodge sounded different now. The hum of the fridge, the faint buzz of the sensors, all the little things I'd installed to protect peace had become witnesses. They'd watched the whole invasion without judgment, and now they were waiting for instruction. I walked through each room one by one. The smell of her perfume still hung faintly in the air, sharp and artificial. In the office, my chair was angled slightly wrong. In the kitchen, my mother's cast iron pan sat unwashed by the sink. I touched the handle and felt a film of ash from the fire. There's a peculiar intimacy in cleaning up after trespass. It's like burying an argument the other person doesn't know they lost. When dawn broke, fog lay across the lake like a white bandage. The sheriff came by around 7, boots crunching on frost. He took his hat off at the threshold. "Morning, Jake." "Morning, Sheriff." He looked around the living room at the folded robe on the armrest. "Quiet, finally." "Quiet enough to hear myself think," I said. He sighed. "We processed her at county. Gary's cooperating. She's claiming stress, overwork, civic duty, everything but accountability. Her lawyer called it an administrative misunderstanding. I call it theft," I said simply. "Jury will too," he answered. "We found her HOA keys, each one tagged for a home in this valley. She'd been keeping them in a monogrammed pouch, like trophies." I poured him a cup of coffee, and we stood by the window watching the fog lift. "Funny thing," he said. "She asked if she could file a counterclaim for defamation. Thought your security cameras were an invasion of privacy." That earned a laugh out of me. Short, bitter, but real. "Tell her the lake gives her privacy lessons daily. Everything that reflects also reveals." McKay smiled under his mustache. "I'll tell her that in court." When he left, the morning turned still again, sunlight sharpening the ripples. I walked down to the dock, the wood damp beneath my boots, and looked back at the house. It stood patient, scarred but unbroken, the way land always is after foolishness passes. By noon, the story had already moved through the valley like wind through dry grass. Ernest came by, leaning against his old fence post, a grin hiding in his beard. "Heard the Queen lost her crown," he said. "She did it herself," I answered. He nodded toward the gate. "Board's meeting at the clubhouse tonight. Reckon they'll be passing that bylaw straight into the lake." "Good place for it," I said. "Water keeps what's worth keeping and buries the rest." Evening brought new quiet, the kind that belongs to truth rather than fear. I lit a small fire again, more for company than warmth, and set David's tablet on the table. The audio file was still there, waiting. I hit play once more, not for evidence this time, but for closure. Bethany's voice filled the room. "He won't know. He's predictable." There was a pause, then Gary's soft reply. "What if he comes back early?" Then her fatal line, sharp and final. "He won't. We just have to make sure we're out by the 31st. I stopped the playback and stared into the firelight. She'd spent months weaving that lie, and one sentence had pulled the whole thing apart. Outside, tires rolled up the gravel again. David's sedan. He stepped out, brushing off the cold. His tie loosened for the first time since I'd known him. "You won't believe this," he said, stepping inside. "The HOA board's in panic mode. They called an emergency session to dissolve the clause." "About time," I said. "They also voted to suspend all fines pending review. Every neighbor who ever got dinged for a mailbox or a flag owes you a drink." "I'll settle for peace," I said. He grinned. "Then you're richer than most men I know." We sat for a while, letting the sound of the lake fill the pauses between us. Then he pulled a paper from his briefcase, official, crisp, notarized. "For the record," he said, sliding it across the table, "the HOA's insurance carrier will cover restitution. You'll get your expenses and property damages reimbursed in full." I looked at the total at the bottom, a sum that would have once impressed me. Now it just looked like arithmetic on grief. "Send it to charity," I said. "Something about housing, maybe. Let the money actually protect someone's home." David studied me for a second, then nodded. "You really are done with this, aren't you?" "Done enough," I said. He left a few minutes later, and I watched his taillights vanish beyond the curve. The fog had rolled back in, soft and forgiving. From the shore, the lake looked like a clean page. I knew tomorrow would bring court filings and news headlines, but for now, the night belonged to still water, and the faint hum of a house reclaiming its own voice. The next morning broke clear and dry, the kind of spring day that makes the pines smell sharp and new. A breeze pushed through the valley, lifting the last scraps of winter from the branches. For the first time in weeks, I opened every window. The house breathed deep, and so did I. But quiet doesn't stay unbroken in Redwater County for long. By noon, the HOA's emergency meeting was in full swing at the community clubhouse, a squat, over-decorated building that looked like a model home no one loved. From my porch, I could hear the faint hum of car engines and the murmur of voices. The board had summoned every homeowner within 5 miles. The invitation had gone out the night before. Urgent. Special session regarding recent legal matter. David insisted I attend. It's not about vengeance, he'd said over the phone. It's about narrative. Let them see the difference between control and integrity. So I went. The clubhouse parking lot was full. Pickup trucks and sedans lined up like a gallery of grudges. People stood in clusters, whispering. Some avoided my eyes. Others nodded in quiet solidarity. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of burnt coffee and panic. At the front of the hall sat what remained of the board. 3 nervous members and an empty chair where Bethany used to sit. The green and gold HOA banner drooped behind them, its edges frayed. They shuffled papers that no longer mattered. David and I took seats near the back. He leaned toward me, voice low. Let them dig the hole before we hand them the shovel. The meeting began with a brittle gavel strike. Due to recent events, one of the board members said, we're here to discuss necessary reforms and the future of Redwater Estates. He spoke for 5 minutes without saying anything. When he finally paused, the room shifted, dozens of homeowners turning toward me like weather vanes in a changing wind. Someone in the crowd muttered, let him speak. Then louder, let Jake talk. The gavel tapped again, weaker this time. Mr. Remy, the chairman said, would you like to address the community? I stood. My voice felt strange in that room, too clean against the murmur of folding chairs. Most of you know what happened, I began. You've seen the headlines, heard the stories. I'm not here to relive them. I'm here because this system, our system, made it possible. The room stilled. When we signed our deeds, we believed this HOA was here to protect property values, I continued. But somewhere along the way, it started protecting egos instead. It fined veterans for mailbox colors, threatened widows over garden fences, and gave one person keys to every front door in Redwater Estates. That wasn't safety. That was surrender. David laid a folder on the table in front of the board. He flipped it open to a printed transcript of Bethany's call, the same audio the sheriff had heard. The words were highlighted, her voice captured in black ink. He won't know. We'll be gone before he comes back. Gasps rippled through the room. The same people who'd once feared her now looked at the page as if it were a mirror showing their own silence. This isn't about punishment, I said. It's about principle. The law already handled the crime. What's left is how we decide to live together after it. A woman in the front row, Mrs. Hill, fined last year for a non-compliant flower arrangement, raised her hand. What do you want us to do? Start fresh, I said. Rescind the emergency key clause. Audit the bylaws. Elect a new board that serves, not rules. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Ernest Walker stood up from the back, leaning on his cane. I move we strike that key rule, he said, effective immediately. Applause followed, not loud, but solid, like the first steady rain after drought. The gavel struck again, almost ceremonial. Motion carried, the chairman said. Papers shuffled, signatures scrawled. The breeze from the open windows caught one stack and sent it tumbling across the floor. Pages fluttered and lifted, swirling through the air like startled birds. Bylaws, fines, old notices, years of pettiness scattering across the hall. A few people laughed, a sound of pure relief. When the laughter died down, I felt David's hand on my shoulder. You've done more for this place in 10 minutes than she did in 6 years. It wasn't me, I said, watching the papers dance through the sunlight. It was the truth finally catching a gust. That afternoon, I walked back along the lake road. The water was restless with wind, glittering in patches. At the dock, I found Gary standing there, hands in his pockets, head bowed. He looked smaller than I remembered. She's taking a plea, he said quietly. Probation, fines, restitution. I'll sell the house and leave the county. Folks here won't forgive easily. I'm not one of them, Stan, I said. You told the truth when it mattered. He nodded once. She didn't just lose her job, she lost herself. I hope someday she understands what she took from you. So do I said. He turned to leave, then hesitated. That night, the robe, she said she felt like she finally belonged to the lake. Funny thing is, the lake never belonged to anyone. I watched him walk away until the trees hid him. The wind picked up again, scattering the last of the meeting's papers along the shore. They drifted onto the water, spinning slowly, words bleeding into ripples. Justice isn't always a verdict. Sometimes it's just the sound of rules dissolving in sunlight. By evening, the sky had turned copper. The mountains to the west threw long shadows across the lake, the kind that stretch like memories you can walk into if you're not careful. The lodge stood behind me, its reflection joined with the tree line, calm and whole again. I hadn't seen it that still since the day I moved in. I carried a small box of the HOA's remaining paperwork down to the dock. Fines, notices, the last printed reminders of Bethany's kingdom. The papers smelled of dust and toner and something old that pretended to be important. I set them on the edge of the pier. When I was a boy, my father used to say that lakes don't forget. They just go quiet until someone stirs the silt. Maybe that was true of people too. Bethany had stirred it deep, and now the lake would settle again, taking her noise with it. The wind died completely. The only sound left was the soft bump of the dock against its ropes. I took one sheet from the box, the emergency access clause, stamped with her signature, and held it to the sunset until the light shone through the watermark. Then I tore it in half. The pieces fluttered once before the water claimed them. Behind me, tires crunched on the gravel. I turned to see Sheriff McKay stepping out of his cruiser, hat in hand. Heard you might be conducting a little symbolic ceremony, he said, half smiling. Just closing a chapter, I replied. He joined me on the dock, his boots solid against the planks. For a while we watched the paper drift out, curling like tiny boats. County judge accepted her plea deal this morning, he said. 3 years probation, restitution, mandatory counseling. She signed the check before lunch. Let's hope she learned something worth the price, I said. McKay nodded, eyes on the water. Maybe she'll move somewhere without lakes, someplace that doesn't echo. We both laughed softly, the kind that ends with a sigh. He left after a few minutes, leaving me alone with the settling dusk. The air smelled of pine and rain that hadn't fallen yet. I walked back up the hill toward the house. The porch light flickered on automatically, gold against the deepening blue. Inside, I poured a glass of scotch, the last bottle Eleanor had chosen before she passed, and sat by the wide window overlooking the lake. The surface mirrored the first stars. Somewhere across the water, a loon called, low and mournful, then was silent. I thought of the past few weeks, the intrusion, the humiliation, the strange calm of watching justice do its work. I realized it wasn't victory I felt, not exactly. It was balance, the land setting its own scales. The lodge creaked as the temperature dropped. I set the glass down and ran my hand along the old cedar table. Each groove and scratch told a story of its own. Meals, repairs, long nights drafting plans for dams that would hold back more than water. I'd built my life on restraint, on the science of control, but here, control was a different thing. It wasn't about keeping the flood out. It was about knowing when to let it wash through and leave you cleaner. A knock came at the door. It was Ernest Walker, holding a covered dish and wearing that same half grin. "Figured you might not have eaten," he said. "My wife made stew. She says heroes don't live on coffee." "Tell her she's half right," I said, stepping aside to let him in. We ate at the kitchen counter, steam fogging the window. He told me the new board had voted him interim president. "Never wanted the job," he admitted. "But someone's got to keep the peace until folks remember how to live without fear of envelopes in their mailbox." "You'll do fine," I said. "You listen more than you talk. That's a rare quality in a president." He chuckled. "So what's next for you, Jake?" "Maybe fix the dock, replant that maple Bethany hated," I said. "Then take a few months off work. I've had enough structures and bylaws for a lifetime." Ernest nodded and stood, setting his empty bowl in the sink. "You earned your quiet, friend. Don't let anyone charge dues for it." After he left, I stepped out onto the porch. The air had cooled, and the moon laid a silver path across the water. At the far end of the dock, the torn pages floated under starlight, slowly darkening as the ink bled out. The lake was reclaiming what was always its own. I raised my glass one last time. "To land," I said softly, "and to those who respect it." The wind moved across the surface, gentle and sure. Somewhere in that whisper, the house, the hills, and the lake all seemed to breathe the same long exhale. The storm had passed, and the lake remembered. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. It just settles quiet, like water finding its level. If you've ever stood your ground against unfair rules, drop a justice in the comments below. I'd love to hear your story. And if you believe some land and some truths are still worth defending, stick around and subscribe for more real stories from the heart of ranch country.